some of the first conflicts with the state, and this is going to be out of Gonzalez's book in chapter 5. Before we get started, though, I want to try to sort of set the stage a little bit about how people looked at things, especially when it comes to deity. We may, as Christians, think, everybody thinks that in the terms of monotheism, that there is one God. But during this time, and actually pretty much even to today, there's only three religions that have really held to monotheism. That is Judaism, Christianity, which we're going to see originally was seen as a sect of Judaism, and of course later on in the 600s beginning Islam. And those are the only three world religions that really hold to a monotheistic view. Everything else is polytheistic, or in other words, many gods, many deities. And this is really the climate that what happens in the church dealing with the state in Rome and throughout the entire region. It's polytheism. The entire idea of a pantheon and a cross or all gods was actually very central to worship and practices in the Roman Empire and all over the world. This is going to create all sorts of interesting ideas. We've talked about a little bit before, and we're going to talk a lot about more in the future. But the real idea behind the deities of the time, I liked a gentleman, John Oswalt, sort of put this type of an idea together, and it's expressed in different ways. But the idea of transcendence, in other words, God is transcendent, He's beyond creation. He's maybe working in it, but He is not of it. Now, and that transcendent view is the biblical worldview. And again, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are the only three religions that even see single deity and transcendence, and of course in various forms and shapes that come along with that. But the rest of the world sees an idea which is referred to as continuity. In other words, nature and man and deity have some continuous relationship with each other and interacting with each other. So nature affects man, man affects deity, deity affects nature, and you're able to cross boundaries. That's where you get magic and omens and signs and all sorts of other interesting things. That's a whole other class. But what's really important in this is people of this time took their beliefs very, very seriously. And they saw that if you offended the gods, in other words, if you didn't practice your religion in a certain way, you would make the gods offended, and then they would affect nature or some other event, whether your children or your crops or thunderstorms or earthquakes or floods, and affect you. But if you could please them and appease them, you could get what you wanted. Hey, I want more kids, so I need fertility. I need better crops. I need blessing in battle. All of these different things, you could manipulate the gods to get them to do what you want. Now, realize that is a very, very different way of thinking. Matter of fact, we're going to see here that some of the ideas of Christianity, the fact that there is no physical idol, is foreign to these people. And Christianity didn't even have, quote unquote, a temple. The Jews at least had a temple, at least until 70 AD. And people would understand that. But having a God that's invisible, they actually call Christians atheists. In other words, you don't have a God. There is no real God. And these ideas, again, we're going to expand upon them later, are going to come into play here as Christianity comes into conflict with the state. Christianity is not trying to be in conflict with the state, but it is. And in this lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the ideas, first off, with conflicts with Judaism. Secondly, we're going to look at some of the persecution under the Emperor Nero, which is towards the end of Paul and Peter's life. Matter of fact, that's where most people think that they died, is under this persecution. And then the persecution under Domitian. And this is near the end of the first century, right at the end of time, right when John's writing the book of Revelation, Gospel of John, those kinds of things. So this is where we see Christianity going to come into conflict with the state. And it's going to begin first with the Jews. And as we've mentioned before, at the beginning, Christianity was just another flavor of Judaism or a sect of Judaism. We've talked about there's the Sadducees, the Pharisees. We see a lot of them talked about in the Gospels. Then we have the Zealots, Simon the Zealot. They were actually sort of the militant group, and they're going to be ones that are going to precipitate the destruction of the temple through a lot of attacks. Matter of fact, they wipe out an entire Roman legion. And then we have the Essenes, and this is where It's sort of like the more monastic kind of guys. They're off in the desert outside of Jerusalem, and that's where you get the Dead Sea Scrolls from, the Qumran community. These guys were Essenes, but they were also very apocalyptic, and eventually a lot of people think that they sort of died out during the 70 AD and again in 135 through militant action. So Christianity at this point looks to most people just like another flavor of Judaism. Judaism was a permitted religion in the empire. It was okay to practice Judaism. Not many people cared for the Jews, and the Romans, weren't real crazy about them because they were kind of stubborn. Later on, we're going to see a lot of laws that the Jews were exempt from. But we're also going to see today that the Jews also, if they created problems for the Romans, they treated them very harshly. And because of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, or at the time a sect of Judaism, we're going to see that Christians actually sometimes fall under persecution just because they have quote-unquote Jewish practices, things that look Jewish. And you think the ideas of synagogues and all sorts of other stuff like that, very similar type of an idea. Now, from a Christian perspective, the early church saw themselves as merely, yes, we're just fulfilling the messianic promise. Here's the Messiah. We're going to spread the good news. Not saying that, okay, we're some new sect. We just are continuing on. But as we know, during persecutions and other difficult times, Christianity spreads to the Gentiles. And we know early on in Acts, we see the debates is, what do we do with all these Gentiles coming in? Do they have to become Jews? And all that kind of stuff. And early on, the Christians, quote unquote, that were Jewish still found favor before the persecutions. But over time, over the next 20, 30 years, Christianity becomes more and more and more and more distinct from Judaism. And the Jews, as we know through the book of Acts, come in conflict with a lot of Christians. And when you add up the conflicts with the Jews, plus people looking at Christians as being atheists, and if you're in a society that says you have to please the gods and something goes wrong, well, who are you going to blame? You're going to blame the ones who are the atheists, the ones who are not trying to appease the gods. So you get this combination early on that's going to create a separation of Christianity from Judaism, but also conflict and persecution by the state because of the association and the separation. And we get to the time period by AD 51, and you see this in Acts 18:2, it's here in your notes. The Emperor Claudius expels the Jews from Rome. And this was an event which was caused by a strife between the followers, as the historians write it down, of Chrestus or Christus or Christus, in other words, Christ, and the Jews. In other words, it's an internal problem. And the Romans didn't care if you had internal religious problems as long as you didn't mess with the state. Well, if your internal religious problems create a problem with the peace and the order of the state in the Roman state, then they had a problem with you. So long as you had your quarrels to yourselves and you didn't cause any problems with Rome, they left you alone. We, again, see that with Paul in Ephesus in the book of Acts. But what ends up happening is the Romans expel the Jews from Rome. And as far as we can tell, that was just related to Rome because the conflicts were there. But that kind of acts as pretty much of a watershed break, and it could be over the next decade. But in this time period, it's becoming very, very clear that Jews and Christians are different, because the Jews are still following the Old Covenant, still following a lot of stuff. The temple's still around. They're still practicing as Jews would, and rejecting the Messiah. So in other words, that's the difference. Is this the Messiah or is this not the Messiah? Christians are, quote unquote, a sect of Judaism, which is now becoming dominantly Gentile, that sees Jesus as the Messiah, as we do. As soon as this happens, though, we have a problem. This problem is Christianity becomes illegal. And if Christianity is illegal, you're not allowed to practice it. And so there's laws against practicing the religions that aren't legal. And you can get yourself into trouble. And this is going to follow Christianity from a legal perspective for at least 250 years now, up until we get to Constantine, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Christianity is illegal, and many times people leave Christians alone. Other times it's used to persecute Christians, as we're going to see. So this break between Judaism and Christianity creates that separation, yet early on, Christianity and Judaism are so closely associated that if you persecute the Jews, Christians kind of sort of look like them, even if they're Gentile, and they get persecuted along with the Jews. So it's kind of funny. What we're going to see develop over time is a lot of laws the Jews get exempted from, and if Christians were seen as a sect of Judaism, they would have been left alone. But later persecutions are going to be because they're not Jews. So it ends up creating a problem for the Christians. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic there. So this moves us to the mid 50s, 54-ish AD. Nero becomes emperor, and a lot of people are very, have varying views of who Nero was. But at the beginning of his rule, he actually was a very popular ruler. And at this time, he left Christians alone. There weren't any real problems. But that absolute power corrupting absolutely, well, Nero kind of went, a lot of people say mad. He was kind of nuts. His megalomania grew, and he kind of had a real problem with being a good emperor. He was power hungry. He was pleasure hungry. And instead of being a ruler and an emperor for the benefit of the Roman Empire, he just, he alienated a lot of people. But we have this historic date. On June 18th, 64 AD, there's this huge fire in Rome. And it ends up basically destroying 10 of the 14 districts of the city. They basically were in ruins. So if you think about that, that's about 2/3 of the city. And we're here in Denver. Well, that would be Denver, proper covers about 40 by 45 miles, so 1,600 or 1,800 square miles. That would be, about 1,200 square miles of area destroyed and burnt. That would be the equivalent impact here in Denver. And a lot of people looked at Nero and said, well, he just wanted to burn the place down to build stuff. He was just a crazy guy. And this is where you get the idea of he was fiddling while Rome was burning. Very, very, very unlikely. Historians go, no, that's not really what's going on. Even though Nero actually tried to organize efforts to put out the fire, to stop the fire. He did a lot of stuff. But because he was so hated, remember, this is 10 years after he took the throne. By this time, he is a hated guy. He was so hated that people kind of just blamed him. It's Nero's fault. He's the guy. He's the problem, etc. And he again, organized homeless shelters, if you will, to try to help the people. But people still just hated him. So easy to blame the guy in charge. The buck stops here type of an idea. And what does a good politician do? What do you think? Good politician is going to do what? Yeah, he's going to try to spin the story. Well, yeah, Nero's going to try to do that. He's going to try to do good stuff. Yeah, those are the kinds of things that he might try to do. But if those things fail, which they did, he tried to sort of spin the story. He tried to help people. You find a scapegoat. That's what you do. You got to find somebody else to blame for it, and you got to find an easy target to do that. Well, at this particular time, we've had problems with the Jews who are associated with Christians who had just been expelled. The Christians are well hated. I'm going to read to you a little bit here in a second from Gonzalez about how much Christians were not liked. And so he picks them. Now he blames them. Oh, these guys started the fire. They're the ones who are the problems. Well, the reality is most scholars believe that this fire was kind of like the Chicago fire. Old Lady Larry's, cow kicked over the lantern in the barn and started the Chicago on fire. So you blame the cow. But here they blame the Christians. And it's because they're just really not liked. A gentleman named Tacitus, who's a Roman historian, basically says Christians were hated for their abominations and hatred of mankind. And I'm going to read here, I want to read to you this is from Tacitus, two different little short passages that Gonzalez quotes. I think it kind of gives you an idea of both the idea that people justly thought Christians should be persecuted, and that yet there's empathy for them after they started getting persecuted. It's kind of a weird kind of a scenario. But let me read to you what Tacitus says. He says, in spite of every human effort of the emperor's largesse and of the sacrifices made to the gods, again, remember they're making sacrifices to the gods to try to appease them, nothing sufficed to allay suspicions nor to destroy the opinion that the fire had been ordered. In other words, this is still Nero's fault. Therefore, in order to destroy this rumor, Nero blamed the Christians. Now, this is Tacitus, a Roman historian, says Nero just picked out the Christians to blame them, who are hated for their abominations and punished them with refined cruelty. Now, the Romans were noted for being pretty good at punishing people, and he says refined cruelty. He sort of took it to a new level. It says, Christ, from whom they take their name, was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. So if you notice here, this is the earliest reference outside of the Scripture of Christ, Pontius Pilate, and execution, and the crucifixion and all that kind of stuff. So this is actually a Roman historian recounting those events. So just reference that others do. This wasn't some fake thing. It says, stopped for a moment, this evil superstition reappeared, not only in Judea, where it had the root of the evil, but also in Rome, where all things sordid and abominable from every corner of the world come together. Thus, first those who confessed, and then this is in brackets, that they are Christians, were arrested. And on the basis of their testimony, a great number were condemned, although not so much for the fire itself as for their hatred of humankind. And we've talked about a little bit about that kind of an idea. People had all sorts of crazy, wild ideas about what Christians believe. They ate their babies. It was all sorts of crazy stuff. And so even though Christians did not start the fire, he still felt, it's okay. They're bad people anyway. So if it wasn't for the fire, let's go ahead and persecute them. That's kind of crazy, but that's kind of the way people thought, And Nero's going, man, I'm safe. I don't have to worry about this because I got the Christians to blame. Matter of fact, I'm going to do so much to show you how much I hated these evil Christians. I'm going to put on a show. I'm going to open my gardens. I'm going to do all sorts of things to prove to you how evil these Christians are. And of course, they're atheists too. So see, they weren't caring about the Roman gods like we were. I mean, we were praying. We were offering sacrifices. We did all this stuff. It was those evil Christians. Let me read you another passage from what Tacitus said, that he talks about how cruel they were, and then yet how empathy actually starts coming to the Christians, and people kind of looking at them a little bit differently, even though, they still thought they were terrible. So this, again, here's what Tacitus says. It says, before killing the Christians, Nero used them to amuse the people. Some were dressed in fur to be killed by dogs. Others were crucified. Nero opened his own, others were still set on fire early in the night so that they might illumine the night. Nero opened his own gardens to these shows, and in the circus he himself became a spectacle, for he mingled with the people dressed as a charioteer, or he rode around in his chariot. All of this aroused the mercy of the people, even against these culprits who deserved an exemplary punishment, for it was clear that they were not being destroyed for the common good, but rather to satisfy the cruelty of one person. And it's interesting that Tacitus looks at this and said, the people even realized that this was all for Nero. He blamed them, was cruel, to put on a show to show how good he was, and yet everybody realized, even though these guys deserved it, we don't like them, they're atheists, they're abomination of mankind, it really was about Nero. And so even this backfired on him. So eventually this guy gets killed. Actually, I believe he committed suicide, if my memory serves me. And what we find out, or maybe he was assassinated. There's another emperor that was committed suicide. But he was assassinated, and this was in 68 AD, so right about this time. So it was 64, and he lasted another 4 years. And at this time, we now get a new guy who comes into power, and this man's name is Vespasian. Now, a little bit of background on him. Vespasian was a Roman general, and he was a really good general. He was a really, actually pretty decent guy, kind of a salt of the earth kind of guy. He wasn't from the wealthy families, but he did well for himself in the military. And Nero didn't like him, and so Nero said, yeah, go back home. Now, I do have to just because many of you know that I love to do gardening and orchards and stuff like that, and I kind of relate to Vespasian because I have a military background, and I go, okay, don't have to fight in the wars anymore, and Nero just sent me back to my villa so I can run my orchards and my beehives and my gardens, and he was quite a happy man. Well, unfortunately, the Jews started getting a little bit rowdy, and the Senate goes, hey, Vespasian, we got to call you back. We need you to go put down those Jews. And this is in 66 AD because the Zealots, which we talked about a little bit earlier, these guys went and actually annihilated a Roman legion. And the Roman Empire could not stand that the Jews wiped out a Roman legion. I mean, those were the invincible, people. If anybody got the idea that you could actually beat a Roman legion, things would not go well. Because remember, the empire was conquered people. Even if they started feeling like Romans, they went, I'd rather be independent. So they call in Vespasian, and he goes back to Israel, to Judea, and he starts, if you will, whooping up on the Jews. And he brings his son along with him, his gentleman named Titus. And when Nero dies, everybody says, oh, well, Vespasian needs to be emperor. Now, there's like 4 emperors, I think, during the year 68. So Vespasian ends up being the 4th one, of course. And people turn and go, all right, you need to be the guy in charge. And he eventually marches back to Rome. The armies turn. They support him. And he becomes emperor. And he basically becomes emperor in 69 AD until 79 AD. During this time period, as he's marching back, he leaves his son, Titus, in charge of finishing subduing Jerusalem. And guess what? Titus is the guy that is the one who builds the wall around Jerusalem and isolates everybody and eventually tunnels under and all sorts of other stuff. And the Zealots are in there fighting. And all of that stuff that you see in Matthew and a lot of these events, not all, a lot of these events you see occurring in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. That was done by Titus, Vespasian's son. After Vespasian dies, he's a pretty decent ruler for about a decade. His son takes over in 79. And you can imagine that the Jews weren't overly loved by the Romans, and certainly not by Titus, because he actually had to finish the job. And the Christians have fled. Israel, the temple's destroyed. And Titus takes over in 79 AD, but he dies, and then Domitian takes over in 81 AD. So this is just a few years later. And to begin with, he kind of leaves the Christians alone, but he puts very heavy taxation fines on the Jews. And he declares that they have to pay the temple tax. So, by the way, there's no temple anymore, but you got to pay that temple tax not to Jerusalem or to the temple. You Jews have to pay it to Rome. Okay, the Jews aren't real crazy about this idea. And some of them do, some of them don't. But here's where this still lingering association with Judaism and Christianity come into play. Anybody condemned or convinced of having Jewish practices, in other words, sort of looks kind of like Jews, And again, the Jews don't have a temple. They're not going to worship in places. They kind of got their synagogues. Let's see, the Christians are reading the scriptures like the Jews. And, there's some other letters. They have a president or elders, a very similar kind of look and feel as the Jews would. And they said, these guys are the same people. So even though it was against the Jews, the Christians sort of got caught in the crossfire, so to speak. That's kind of how all these things intermingle. And again, there's the separation continuing on. But the scope of the persecution, like under Nero, was Rome. And here under Domitian, it's predominantly Rome and then modern-day Turkey or Asia Minor. And there was a strong concentration of Christians in that area. And this is, again, where the seven churches of the book of Revelation. Again, Domitian is right here at the end of the first century, during this time period, and into the time where the book of Revelation is written, etc. Now, Domitian is kind of like Nero. Starts out okay, gets worse, gets cruel, gets crazy, gets, assassinated. And so in 96 AD, he basically was assassinated because he was such a tyrant. What's going to happen, though, is these early persecutions, these early changes. Again, this isn't just something that happens overnight. After Domitian, you kind of get periods of peace and calm, and then you get periods of persecution. And it's not like, okay, everybody hated Christians. Christians were decent people. There's a letter, an apologist that we'll talk about later, the letter to Diogenetus. He's a pagan that this unknown person writes as an apology. And he basically says, look, no matter where you go, in the city, in the country, barbarians, cultured people, whatever, Christians just live life. They don't dress any weird way. They don't speak any different. They honor the law and yet surpass it. They care for others. They share what they have, not their bed. They're faithful. All these good things. And he says, and yet people hate them, and nobody really understands why. They're good citizens. They're good parents. They care for people, and yet people still just don't like them. And so it's interesting when you think about that kind of stuff, that as Christians, they were just people. And whatever culture they were in, they were just people of their culture. They weren't even trying to stand out except by their character. There wasn't, hey, I wear this badge here and I'm a Christian. They just lived. They just spoke. They just had their life. But it was so God-honoring. They lived out, the Sermon on the Mount. That people saw who they were. And so what we're going to see here is these are the early conflicts. And we're going to see conflicts come and go. And yet people still just couldn't figure out a Christian. As a matter of fact, what some of the emperors are going to find out later is the harder you persecute them, the more people are attracted to them because they live their faith out. Now, not everybody's going to do that. All of us are going to fail. They're going to fail. It's kind of a difficult situation to be in. But these first couple of decades of conflict with the state and persecution with different people is going to lead to something else. And it starts to become almost a badge of courage. And we're going to see this develop. We're going to see this idea of a badge of courage of being martyred. And some people almost rush to become martyrs later because they say, see, I'm faithful. And, if I'm martyred for the faith, God's going to, bless me, or people are going to think well of me, or something. I don't know. But this thinking starts coming up. And then later on, we're going to see this idea of martyrs, people who were, again, martyr just means witness. You will be my witnesses. You will be my martyrs. It's the same word. You will be my witnesses. Okay, you're going to be the ones who are going to testify of me. And so a person who was a martyr was somebody who testified through their life, and even to death, whatever that happened to be, that they were faithful people. But now people start turning to, well, here's where the martyrs, saint whoever whoever the Holy One was, and people would come together in remembrance. It's kind of like a testimony, but it's testimony from the dead. And then people start thinking, well, maybe there's a special thing that I got to do while I'm at the place where the martyr is. And then they start praying, and then they start venerating the saints, and then they start looking to those people as, the saint of this or the saint of that. And guess what? You get all this development from people who are just trying to be faithful. And yet, what does mankind do? Over time, superstition, ignorance, and that continuity thinking starts creeping back into the church because it gets infiltrated with basically pagan thought. And all of these early martyrs, people kind of look at them and go, hey, they're special. Unfortunately, that's not the way we need to look at things. So this sort of gives us the launch into the post-apostolic time period. This is, all the apostles are gone. We're beginning to see the conflict and shift of the church, and we're going to be moving into the 2nd century. And we're going to continue looking at that in our next lesson. So, if there's any questions, we can talk about those after class, but hopefully that will give you a good idea of how things changed, how things shifted between the Jews, the church, and the state, and all of the ramifications that came along with that.